she hadn't called anyone. That was the thing Nina kept turning over in her mind as she pressed the folded dish towel harder against her forearm and watched the blood seep through in a slow, dark bloom. She had the number for the syndicate medic. She had Gault's direct line, the one she'd used exactly twice in 3 years, both times at his instruction, never at her own initiative. She had her cell phone sitting 4 inches from her right hand on the bathroom tile. She hadn't picked it up. It wasn't stubbornness, or not entirely, it was math. Walsh ran the medic. Walsh logged every call Gault received after 10 p.m. Walsh was the reason she was sitting on the cold floor of a bathroom she'd never managed to make look like a home, pressing a cloth to a 4-inch gash that needed stitches she wasn't going to be able to put in herself. Calling anyone inside the organization meant telling Walsh she was still breathing. So she hadn't called. Outside the single grimy window, the Scarborough streets were doing what they always did at 2 in the morning, shuffling, muttering, staying alive in that particular quiet way of places that have learned not to attract attention. Nina had lived here for 2 years, and she still didn't know the names of the people across the hall. That was deliberate. Visibility was expensive, and she'd never been able to afford it. Her forearm had stopped bleeding properly about 20 minutes ago, which she knew was a bad sign. The cut wasn't deep enough to kill her, but the man who'd given it to her had used the kind of blade that left ragged edges, and the skin around it had gone hot and tight in a way that meant infection was already in the conversation. She had acetaminophen, 2 bandanas, and a bottle of grocery store isopropyl alcohol under the sink. She'd used all 3. The laptop was open on the toilet lid. The hard drive she'd pulled from the courier's bag, before he got his hands around her throat, was plugged into the side of it. She'd cracked the encryption at 11:47 p.m., slower than she wanted, because her right hand kept cramping, and she'd spent the next hour reading through 18 months of Walsh's careful, patient theft. It was almost elegant, in the way that really terrible things sometimes were. 3%, skimmed from the top of 12 separate revenue streams, routed through a shell company registered in New Brunswick that existed on paper only, small enough to read as rounding errors on the consolidated statements she produced every quarter. She would have caught it eventually. She'd been close to catching it in March when Walsh had restructured the holding accounts, and she'd had to rebuild her tracking model from scratch. He'd bought himself 6 more months by making her do extra work. She had to admit that part was impressive in a way that made her want to put her head through the drywall. The files went further than the skimming. There was a correspondence thread, encrypted, but not as well as he'd thought, between Walsh and a man she knew by reputation. Douglas Hadley, patriarch of the Halifax shipping operation, whose daughter Portia was currently 2 days away from becoming Gault's wife. The thread was long. The arrangement was simple. Walsh would hand over the master routing keys for Gault's offshore accounts, the shift schedules for his personal security, and the access codes to the Brampton warehouse. In exchange, Hadley would absorb Walsh's gambling debts, currently sitting at $1.8 million, and Walsh would walk away with a finder's fee and his teeth. Gault would not walk away from anything, that was the point. The wedding reception was the window. Portia knew. Her father had told her the outline, enough to keep her cooperative and out of the way. The actual work would happen during the signing. Gault would raise a glass, the toast would go down smooth, and by morning Douglas Hadley would have the codes, the contacts, and a legitimate reason to explain why his new son-in-law was found unresponsive at his own wedding. Nina had found the courier carrying the physical confirmation, the signed agreement, the payment transfer receipt, in the parking structure under the financial district on Tuesday afternoon. She'd planned a clean intercept, in and out. She hadn't planned on the courier being a Hadley enforcer who'd done this before and who'd had a friend waiting 2 cars back. She'd gotten the drive. She'd gotten away. She'd left some blood on the concrete, which she felt slightly guilty about. That had been 31 hours ago. She hadn't eaten since Tuesday morning. She knew that was a problem. She also knew that the closest thing to food in her apartment was a box of crackers she'd bought in September and a can of chickpeas, and neither of those required the kind of cooking that involved standing up for more than 90 seconds, which she was currently optimistic about managing. What she needed, what she was trying to figure out how to get, was a way to put this information in front of Gault without going through Walsh to do it. That meant reaching him directly. That meant his personal line, which she'd only used twice, which he'd answered in under 2 rings, which meant he kept it close. She was going to have to trust that he'd keep it close again. She was still working out the exact language. She didn't have the luxury of sounding panicked, because panicked meant unreliable, and unreliable meant he'd verify through Walsh before he acted, which would get them both killed, when she heard footsteps on the 4th floor landing. She'd lived in this building long enough to know its sounds. The family on 4A had a teenager who came in late and walked heavy. The man in 4C had a dog that skittered on the hardwood when he let it in. The stairs creaked in a specific sequence. 1st tread, 3rd tread, landing, 1st tread again, when someone was walking deliberately, not stumbling. These footsteps were deliberate. They stopped outside 4B. Nina reached across the bathroom floor and wrapped her fingers around the handle of the kitchen knife she'd dragged in from the counter after the courier's friend had stopped following her. Her arm screamed. She didn't put it down. She heard a hand try the knob. Then a single knock 2 beats slow. Then Carr. She knew that voice. She'd heard it give orders in 2 languages and a silence that was worse than both. She'd heard it go completely flat in a way that made experienced men step backward. She'd heard it once, asking his driver to slow down because there was a dog in the road. She hadn't heard it outside her door at 2:15 in the morning, speaking her last name like a question and a statement at the same time. Nina set the knife down. She pressed her good hand against the bathtub rim and pushed herself upright. The room tilted. She held still, jaw tight, waiting for it to stop, and when it mostly did, she dragged herself to the door, fingers trailing the wall. She got it open on the 2nd try. Gault stood in the hallway, with rain darkening the shoulders of his coat, and something in his expression that she had no name for, because she'd never seen it there before. He was looking at her forearm first. The bandana was soaked through, gone from blue to a deep burgundy, and then at her face, which she was aware looked significantly worse than usual, given that the left side of it was mostly bruise. She'd been thinking about what to say to him for 6 hours. She'd run several versions. What she actually said was, "How did you get this address?" "Your intake form." His voice was very quiet, from 3 years ago. "That's in a locked file." "I know." She looked at him. He looked at her. The hallway smelled like the neighbors' cigarettes and the mildew that lived in the baseboards, and Gault stood there in his $4,000 coat, looking like he'd been inserted into the wrong photograph. "Walsh logged the address when I filled out the paperwork," Nina said. "He would have. Walsh is not available to log anything at the moment." Gault's voice stayed level. "Can I come in?" She stepped back. He closed the door behind him. He took in the apartment in about 4 seconds. She watched him do it, the quick sweep of someone cataloging, and she could see the moment he registered that there was no furniture. No couch, no kitchen table, no rug. Just her laptop on the folding chair by the window, the hard drive, the stacked external backups lined up along the baseboard, and a sleeping bag rolled tight in the corner of what was theoretically a bedroom. He didn't say anything about it. That was almost worse than if he had. "Sit down," he said instead. "I'm fine." "You have a fever. I can see it from here." He moved toward the kitchen, pulled open the cabinet under the sink with the ease of someone who'd searched spaces before, and came back with the isopropyl and the remaining clean bandana she'd left on the counter. "Sit." Nina sat. Specifically, she sat on the floor, because the floor was what there was, and after a moment he crouched in front of her without any visible objection to that fact. He was gentle. That was the thing she hadn't expected, because nothing about Gault suggested gentle as a mode he operated in. But he unwrapped the soaked bandana from her forearm with careful, deliberate fingers, and when he looked at the cut underneath, he made a sound low in his throat that she decided not to interpret. "This needs sutures." "I know." "Why didn't you call Renner?" Renner was the medic. She felt him watching her face when he asked it. "Renner works for Walsh." A pause. He was processing that. She saw it, not confusion, because Gault didn't do confusion in public, but a recalculation happening somewhere behind his eyes. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She kept it clean, the way she kept the accounts clean. No filler, no hedging, just the sequence of facts in the order they mattered. Walsh skimming, the shell company in New Brunswick, the correspondence with Hadley, the courier, the hard drive, what the hard drive contained, the wedding reception window, the toast. Gault listened without interrupting. He continued working on her arm while she talked, pouring alcohol that made her teeth clench, pressing gauze he apparently produced from somewhere inside his coat, wrapping it tight enough to matter. When she got to the part about Portia knowing, his jaw shifted. When she got to the part about the toast, he went very still. "Walsh has your security shift rotations," Nina said. "The access codes for Brampton. He didn't have the offshore routing keys yet. That was what the courier was delivering, the final transfer. I have the drive. But if you act tonight without knowing exactly what else he's already handed over, you'll miss something." Gault looked at her for a long moment. "The laptop," he said. "Can you walk me through it?" "I've been waiting to walk someone through it for 30 hours. Something moved across his face. It wasn't quite guilt. It was adjacent to it. He stood. He looked around the empty apartment again, and this time when he looked at the sleeping bag in the corner and the crackers on the kitchen shelf and the total absence of anything personal, no photographs, no books left out, nothing that said a person actually lived here, she saw him doing a different kind of calculation. "When did you eat last?" he asked. "That's not relevant right now." "Carr." She looked at the floor. "Tuesday." The silence after that was very particular. She'd worked in proximity to Gault for 3 years, and she knew his silences the way you learn the sounds of a building. Which ones were nothing? Which ones were loading? This one was loading. He didn't say what he was thinking. He pulled his phone from his coat, made a call that lasted 40 seconds, spoke in a voice too low for her to make out the words, and hung up. Then he sat down on the floor across from her, this man who ran a multi-city operation, who wore suits that cost more than she made in a month, who had a rehearsal dinner presumably happening somewhere in the city right now, and he sat on the bare hardwood floor of her apartment and said, "Start at the beginning. Take me through the drive." She started at the beginning. It took 40 minutes. He asked 3 questions, all of them precise, all of them aimed at gaps she'd half noticed and filed away and hadn't had the clarity to fully examine. She answered them. In 2 cases, his questions sent her back to the files on screen, and she found the thing he'd seen coming before she'd seen it herself, which she would have found annoying, except that the things he found were useful. The second call from Walsh came while she was mid-sentence. Gault looked at the screen, looked at her, and hit decline. "He'll know you're not at the rehearsal dinner," Nina said. "He already knows. He'll start moving the timeline up. Let him." Gault's voice was very calm. She'd heard that calm before from a distance, and she'd understood it intellectually. Sitting 3 feet from it on a cold floor, she felt the specific gravity of it. The way it didn't mean nothing was happening. It meant everything was already decided. He made a 3rd call. This one he stood for, walking to the window while he spoke. She caught the names of 2 men she knew from the security roster, Devitt, Parish, and an address that was the Brampton warehouse. She caught the phrase "lock it down from the outside." She caught the phrase "Walsh is a liability, treat it accordingly." He hung up. He stood at the window for a moment with his back to her, and she watched his reflection in the dark glass, the set of his shoulders, the thing happening in the lines of his face that he probably thought the dark was hiding. Portia?" she asked. Her father arranged the approach. "She's a participant, not the architect." He turned around. "She'll be escorted to the airport by morning." "And Walsh?" "Walsh is currently in a conversation with Devitt that he is not going to enjoy." Nina thought about Walsh, who had spent 18 months carefully dismantling everything she'd helped build, who had bought himself out of a gambling debt with someone else's life. She thought about the Tuesday afternoon in the parking structure, the sound her knee made when it hit the concrete, the weight of the enforcer's hands. "Good," she said. Gault crossed back to her. He looked down at her for a moment, something shifting in his expression that she couldn't read cleanly in the low light. Then he sat back down, on the floor. Next to her this time, not across. "You've been sitting on this for 30 hours, he said. It wasn't a question. "I needed proof you'd believe before Walsh could reach you first. If you had come to me Tuesday, you would have called Walsh." She said it evenly, because it was true and they both knew it. "You would have asked him to look into it. He would have had a week's warning, and I'd have nothing left to show you." The silence. "I know," he said finally. "I'm not reproaching you." She wasn't. She understood the architecture of trust, how it built, what it relied on, how long it took to know the difference between a foundation and a facade. She'd worked inside Gault's organization for 3 years, and she'd understood without being told that Walsh stood close to him in a way her own position never had. She'd built her case around that fact, not resented it. "I'm explaining why I waited. You waited bleeding on a bathroom floor for 30 hours. I've had worse weeks." She said it without emphasis, and she felt him go still beside her with the particular stillness of someone who'd heard more than was intended. She hadn't meant to give him that much. "The apartment," he said carefully, "the way you're living here. That's my business. Humor me." Nina looked at the middle distance. Outside, someone's car alarm started up and stopped again. She could hear the building breathe around them, the radiators that didn't work, the family 2 floors down, the city not quite sleeping. "I have a brother," she said, "Ellie. He's 24. He has a degenerative condition. Early onset, bad draw, there's no good version of it. He's in a facility in Sudbury that has a garden and staff who know his name and the specific way he needs help that I can't give him myself." She kept her voice flat, the way she kept the numbers flat. "The facility costs more than my rent, so I made choices." She wasn't looking at him. She didn't need to look at him to know what his face was doing. She'd told this story exactly twice, both times briefly, both times to people who'd asked directly, and both times she'd watched them calculate whether it made her a liability. Gault was quiet for a long moment. "Then does the care meet his needs?" She blinked. That was not the question she'd been waiting for. "Yes," she said. "It's yes. And you've been funding it on your salary from me. That's not an accusation I'm making. It's a fact I'm establishing." He was looking at her profile. She could feel it. "You have been working for me for 3 years, doing work that keeps my financial infrastructure from dissolving, and you have been living like this because you didn't want to ask for more, and you didn't want to appear vulnerable. Appearing vulnerable in your organization has a specific cost. I know what it costs." His voice was quiet. "I set that cost. I know exactly what I built." She looked at him then. His face, up close, without a desk or a meeting table between them, was different from the version she knew. Older, maybe, or just less edited. The scar that ran from his jaw toward his collar was silver in the low light. He looked like someone who was very tired of a specific thing and had not yet decided what to do about it. "Walsh is handled," he said. "The Hadley arrangement is finished. The wedding is finished." He paused. "I'm cancelling tonight. The merger loses you a significant shipping corridor. I'm aware. The replacement of those routes will take at minimum. Carr." He said her name the way he always said it, last name, flat, the tone of a man who'd run out of patience with the direction the conversation was heading, but his eyes didn't match the tone. "Stop running the numbers for a minute." She stopped. You nearly died in a parking structure on Tuesday, he said, and you have been sitting here alone by yourself, cataloguing my losses. It's my job. Your job, he said, is currently at rest. He stood, and she watched him do what she'd watched him do 100 times in meetings: pull out his phone, find a contact, dial. This time the call lasted less than 20 seconds. When he ended it, he looked back down at her. My doctor is 20 minutes out. He's discreet, and he is mine, not Walsh's. He'll see to your arm and anything else that needs seeing to. I don't need. You have a fever, and you haven't eaten in 30 hours, and you bandaged yourself with a dish towel. His voice didn't rise. It never rose. That was actually more effective than if it had. You need. She looked up at him from the floor. In 3 years, she'd learned to read Gault through margins, what was absent from his reports, what he asked for, versus what he actually wanted to know, where the gaps lived in his ledgers. She'd never had occasion to read him like this, close, sitting on the same floor. He extended his hand. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put hers in it and let him pull her up. She swayed. He didn't make a thing of it. He just kept his grip on her hand until the room settled, and she felt the warmth of his palm against her cold fingers and decided not to think about it. The drives, she said. We need to pull the complete Walsh correspondence before we move against Hadley's people. There are 3 separate threads, and the third one has a contact name I don't recognize yet. We'll go through it tonight. He held the door open. But you're sitting in a chair. I've been sitting on a floor for 30 hours. A chair is a significant upgrade. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. The nearest he came to one. Carr, he said. I know. She picked up the hard drive. I know. Let's go. The syndicate doctor arrived in 22 minutes and spent the next hour undoing the damage Nina had managed and the damage she hadn't. He confirmed 2 cracked ribs, debrided and properly sutured the forearm, started an IV line for fluids and antibiotics she'd needed a day ago, and told her without apparent emotion that her immune system was running on spite. She told him that was accurate. Gault sat at the end of the table while she walked him through the drives. The fever made the edges of things softer, and twice she caught herself losing the thread, and both times he pulled it back. Not helpfully, not as though he was rescuing her, but the way she'd pulled threads back for him 100 times across a conference room table. Like it was a shared task. Walsh's third correspondent turned out to be a city councillor with a specific interest in harbour rezoning. Gault's expression, when that came clear, was something she filed away. She put it next to the dog on the road. At some point, past 3 in the morning, she stopped being able to maintain full sentences. She was aware of this the way she was aware of a lot of things, clearly from a slight distance, without the ability to prevent it. She registered her head going down onto her folded arms on the table. She registered Gault's voice somewhere nearby, low and precise, giving instructions she was too far under to follow. She did not register being moved. She registered warmth, which had been absent from her life for long enough that it registered as significant even through sleep. In the morning, the light came in at an angle she didn't recognize, and for the 4 seconds between sleeping and awake, she didn't know where she was. Then she did. The room smelled like cedar and clean linen, and nothing like the particular combination of damp and effort that her apartment on Carr had developed over 2 years. The mattress beneath her had memory foamed itself to her shape. The IV line was gone. The bandaging on her arm was clean, white, and professional. On the nightstand, a glass of water, a packet of crackers, and a folded note. She unfolded it. Walsh confessed at 4 a.m. the Hadley family is managing a significant recalibration. Portia is on a flight to Halifax. Do not open the laptop. Your brother's facility has been contacted. The account is settled in full through the end of next year. This is not a loan, and it is not charity. Consider it a correction. Eat the crackers. Nina sat with the note in her hands for a long time, the morning pressed against the curtains. Somewhere in the house, this was a house, she understood, not just an estate in the abstract. She could hear footsteps on the floor below, deliberate, measured footsteps. She folded the note. She ate the crackers. When the door opened and Gault came in with 2 cups of coffee, both black because after 3 years he knew how she took it without asking. She had already had several conversations in her head, most of them careful and professional and appropriately boundaried. She said thank you for Eli. He set her cup on the nightstand. He sat in the chair across from her, not on the edge of the bed, which she appreciated. "Don't thank me," he said. "It should have been done before." He looked at her, measuring something. "I missed a great deal. You were running a syndicate. You were keeping the syndicate running. And I did not look at you." He said it plainly, the way he said things that were true and uncomfortable and needed saying directly. "I looked past you. I trusted Walsh over the information that was sitting in front of me, and you nearly paid for that in a parking structure on Tuesday. I made it out of the parking structure. Because you are exceptionally stubborn. I prefer thorough." The corner of his mouth, that small, controlled movement again. He set his coffee cup down. "There's a room in this house," he said. "A proper one. Not the East Wing guest suite where the doctor put you last night, but something with a window that faces the garden and enough space for a desk if you want one." He paused. "The Brampton books need to be rebuilt from scratch. Walsh contaminated 18 months of records, and there's no one I trust to do that work." She looked at him. "You're offering me a job," she said. "I'm offering you a room and the job you already have, done properly." He held her gaze, "with correct compensation. And without you having to manage crises in a building I should have noticed the address of a long time ago." It was, she thought, the least romantic proposition she had ever received. It was also, in the specific world they both occupied, the most serious kind of offer there was. Gault didn't protect things he didn't value. She'd seen enough of his ledgers to understand exactly how he calculated worth. "The Hadley corridor," she said. "I've been thinking about the gap it leaves. There's a freight operator out of Thunder Bay. I pulled their public filings last year when we were looking at the northern routes. If you're open to a smaller initial arrangement." "Carr." "I know." "No, you don't, or you'd have stopped." She looked down at the bedspread. She hadn't stopped because she didn't know how. Running the numbers was the one thing she'd always been able to do, regardless of what the rest of her life was doing, regardless of what she'd been told to feel or not feel, regardless of how cold the floor was or how empty the fridge was or how long it had been since anyone had noticed she was in the room. "The Thunder Bay option is worth examining," he said, and something in his tone had shifted, not warmer exactly, but more direct, the way he spoke when he'd arrived at a decision and was done circling it. "Walk me through it when you're vertical." She looked back up at him. His face, in the morning light, was the same unedited version she'd seen on her bathroom floor, the version below the calibrated surface, tired and steady, and paying attention in a way she hadn't known, until now, that he'd been paying at all. The scar along his jaw caught the light. His hands around his coffee cup were still. "Okay," she said. He nodded once, the way he closed things that were decided. Outside the window, Toronto was getting on with its morning. Somewhere north of the city, her brother was in a facility with a garden that had been a source of dread last week and would not be a source of dread next week. On the nightstand beside her, Gault's handwriting sat folded in a square, practical, direct, and in its own particular language, the most careful thing anyone had ever said to her. She drank her coffee. She started building the Thunder Bay numbers in her head. She didn't have to do it from the floor anymore.